Should I fix you some sandwiches? Some sandwiches. I could make you one before you leave. How many sandwiches do you want? How much lettuce do you want? Okay.
Dying to explore.
Well, thank you, Ian. You know, the subject of giants is kind of in the same category as dinosaurs from the standpoint everybody is familiar with them, from the children's stories of the ogres, Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack the Giant Killer. All of the mythologies of the world all go back to the time of giants. The incredibly oversized or non-human-sized monuments and sacred sites around the world. And fascinatingly enough, as I've tracked all the different statements from oral history, oral tradition, written records, stelae, hieroglyphics, you name it, the subject of giants can't be escaped or can't be gotten away from, especially when, you know, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, for the first time ever, the picture that we put up on our website to kind of hallmark your show tonight, the picture of the tomb of the giant. By the way, that's not me. I'm 54, so that picture was taken after World War II in Egypt.
Okay, I'm glad you told me that.
Yeah, and my webmaster didn't put the right heading on it, so you guys took it off my picture. But that's one of the coast-to-coast listeners whose father was actually in Egypt. He's holding a turban that is brass-lined, and he literally was allowed to see, because of his access to the military in those days, he was allowed to see the giant, the 10-foot skeleton. Now, in my book, I basically go over, as you know, I take the entire world and break it down by the records of not only the world's most famous historians, Strabo, Josephus, everybody who's anybody, Berosus the Persian, Herodotus, everybody has mentioned the giants, and it's my contention that all mythology is based on the real fact that there were these individuals who were phenomenally strong, supernaturally brilliant, and absolutely were not mankind's friends, and they were ultimately destroyed, or they would have destroyed mankind.
Well, and this is the part that I also think stands in contrast to how you had originally talked about giants in the introduction there, that, you know, we hear about Jack and the Beanstalk, but while he was a physical giant, he was obviously not a mental giant. And I think that's part of that image that we have of giants, is that the bigger they are, the dumber they fall. And that we are often, you know, that's kind of how we prove ourselves as giant killers, is we use our intellect to compensate for our lack of size. So when you talk about them being super smart, I think that part is sort of a curve in the story that we don't expect.
Well, and I think that's a good point. One of the most... are you there?
I am.
I'm sorry, someone cut out.
Oh,
one of the most amazing stories is King Og, O-G, who is one of the guys that's in very well detailed in the Old Testament. And he basically was 18 feet tall. And in Deuteronomy chapter 3, it talks about King Og, but he was known for his brilliance because he was the last of the giants to be able to resist the attacks upon the giants. Then when you get to the Germanic giants, the Cimbrians and others, I mean, good night, these giants were able to wipe out until a certain point. They were able to wipe out all of Caesar's crack Roman soldiers. So we're not talking about just a bunch of, unshaven, just big guys with a lot of strength. We're talking about some very wise men, especially when it came to battlefield tactics.
Well, and that is its own kind of brilliance. But I mean, this notion of them being intellectually superior as well as physically intimidating, that part is new for me in the giant lore. But let's start at the beginning. For those people that don't know, give an overview, if you would, on how you believe giants came to Earth and how long they lasted on the Earth as a group, which could be reasonably called the giants, as opposed to just tall people amongst us.
Well, first of all, going back to Genesis, it states there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God, meaning the angels, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And it doesn't matter what myth, what historic structure you put it in, you always have this idea of angels, or as some people, as you're aware, believe the spacemen came to Earth and had sex with Earth women, producing a genetic hybrid. I don't believe that, but I believe specifically that we've got the history books complete, the mythological records complete, with the idea that there were a group of guys, and they were guys that came to Earth, had sexual relations with the Earth women, and produced these supernatural men, which the Bible says that became the mighty men of renown.
Now, other than the biblical record of Genesis 6 on this story, why not females giants coming to Earth?
Well, first of all, the interesting, that's a good question. In all, and I want to share this with you, whether it's Greek mythology, Babylonian mythology, any of the ancient Egyptian mythology, it's always in the masculine sense. Now, there were giantesses produced out of that union. I mean, obviously, depending on, the sex of the child giant, you would have giantesses, and there's a whole bunch of fascinating women in history who fulfilled that role, and I'm talking big ladies. I'm talking 12-footers.
Right.
So the point is that, but it's an anomaly that they're always spoken of in the context of males, and that's one of the most striking anomalies that, as I've researched this, that pops right out into the common focus.
Well, I'll just throw something out at the end. You just respond to it as you want, but just remember, too, that in Hebrew, the collective of anything would probably be in the male, not female or neuter form. So even if you're talking about, like, as we say, mankind, we don't just mean men, we mean humankind.
Right.
And so I just wonder where in their story, because, if we get too gender specific with that language, it might mean that there were no female giants. But it seems to me somehow, in order for these giants to continue to create more giants, is that there have to be these giantesses in there somewhere in order to keep them big. Or if they kept, reproducing with normal human-sized women, at the time would have been, 4 to 5 feet tall, it would just dramatically decrease the likelihood that there would ever be any more giants after a few generations.
Well, yeah, but that's absolutely not accurate from the standpoint that even going beyond the linguistic uniqueness of Hebrew, you're finding it in, let's just say, Babylonian, the Akkadian language, too, especially when you're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right.
Now, for a lot of years, and for those of you that don't know, and this is on my website, so you can go and read it, it's fascinating, but Gilgamesh was believed to be a fictional character by, quote, the mainstream archaeologists, anthropologists, those who questioned everything was myth to them. But a few years ago, the actual tomb of Gilgamesh was found and basically said, I'll paraphrase it, here lies Gilgamesh, 2/3 God, 1/3 man. And on the engraving, actually the stele, the inscribed rock image, you have a gentleman that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 feet, seated, holding a lion by its rear feet. And next to it, you have one of the interesting guys that's in history called the Lion Man of Moab. And so you've got a contemporary archaeological find bearing witness and solidifying and validating the fact that what mainstream archaeologists said was only fiction, and Epic of Gilgamesh is 4,500 years old, is very, very now prominent, and I find it unique and truly fascinating that the main story, the oldest poetic narrative now, the validation has come through modern archaeology.
Well, so just then, so we wrap up the timeline as you present it, the fallen ones come and they procreate with Earth women, and this line of giants continues for how long?
Well, it continued both through the fall and after. It continued through Noah's flood and after, because again, Genesis says there were giants in those days, both before and after. And now the interesting thing that you have is you actually have tales of giants, and I'm talking living giants, in everything from the Solomon Island to different parts of the world. And again, modern man has a hard time finding it. But for those that don't know what we're talking about, that are on the Internet, they can go to the link we put up for Coast to Coast and click on it. You can see the Kashmir giants on the front of my book. One of them's 9 feet tall. One of them's 10 feet tall at the turn of the century. That was 1905 when the British 6-foot explorer was taken with those pictures, Ian.
Well, and that's fascinating, and I love that photo. And again, thanks for including that kind of work because it really helps bring it home for me. But explain, though, when did giants stop being a nation of giants? When was the, if you'll pardon the term, the diaspora of giants? When did they stop being some sort of cohesive nationality, if you will, that had that reigned together or worked and survived in a group?
Well, probably the most contemporary group, when we're talking group, hundreds of giants, we're probably talking the Solomon Island giants, because when the Japanese landed at Guadalcanal, even the Japanese historians, now we're talking obviously World War II, were basically the advanced party that landed on one side of the island was decimated, and they were literally destroyed by the giants. Now, people still can't grasp that we're talking about these individuals. The question that will come up, obviously, in the show is, where are they if they're real, and why aren't they presented to the public? I have an answer for that, but we'll get to that a little later.
Okay, well...
But to answer your question...
Yeah, because you're killing me on that. I'm so dying to know the answer to that. But go ahead. No, finish up.
But all of the great explorers, from De Soto, Magellan, Captain Cook, all the circumnavigators of the world, all encountered giants. And so when you're talking about Cortez and the chronicles of his that were taken both in in Mexico, and those who went into South America, you have contemporary writings of groups of giants. For instance, the Patagonians up until the 1850s, 1890s. Patagonia, by the way, the word means big feet. I actually have on my website a documentation of the Gentleman's Gazette, I think written in about 1767, that goes into great detail on Magellan's encounter of the Patagonian giants.
All right. So just so if I can understand this, we believe that the giants were formed by fallen angels that come to a particular area in the Bible during a period of time. And then do they spread out from there almost immediately, or is there a central event that you believe in the timeline of giants which then sends them spreading out all over the world? Or did these fallen angels, as you described them, come down simultaneously to various places around the earth?
Well, they first descended on Mount Hermon, which is in the Middle East. But then there was a diaspora, or a dispersion of them, because, again, when they encountered the Israelites, God gave the command to Joshua and Caleb to go into the Promised Land, and that's when the famous statement, when Joshua and Caleb go into the Promised Land to spy it out, they said, we were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were in ours. And they talked about the land being a terrible land because it devoured its inhabitants. One of the unusual things about the giants, that no matter where you encounter them worldwide, they're always cannibalistic. And it's fascinating because, again, it doesn't matter if it's Caesar dealing with the German giants, or Caesar dealing with the Gaelic giants, or the British giants. The issue is they're always dealing with some pretty nasty characters. And by the way, this was the basis of Hitler's wanting to build the Aryan race, rebuild it, was based on the Teutonic giants,
right.
The Cimbrians. And what most people don't understand, these guys were 12 to 14 feet tall, as recorded by the different Caesars that had to fight them. And, I mean, we're talking about some amazing battles. For instance, one of the words that enters into common usage that most people don't realize comes from the giants. It's cutting someone down to size. That came from the infamous battles of the Roman soldiers against the German giants. And by the way, this is all cataloged in my book, and I've got enough footnotes to make anybody sink under the weight of them.
You do, yeah.
But I mean, I've got thousands of footnotes. So the interesting thing is that the average Roman fighting soldier came up to the kneecaps of some of these giants.
Get out. I mean,
and what's amazing is that there were times when, with the exception of 2 or 3 men, the giants totally wiped out all of Caesar's army, and until a really amazing guy by the name of Marius, a 25-year-old general, figured out how to basically build lion traps and lure the giants in. But what was fascinating, they had blonde hair down to their waist. They were incredibly tall, and they wore their hair kind of in spikes. Some of them wore it in spikes. Some wore fancy clothes. Some wore no clothes. But the point is that the sound of their nasal pharyngeal scream was unearthly. And again, we'll get to this a little later on in the show, but it's very much like in recorded history. It's like what contemporary people around the world have encountered when they've encountered the Yeti, the abominable snowman, the Yowie. You know, they're known by different names all around the world. But the sound of these things was amazing, and that's what basically disheartened initially the Roman soldiers. Also, the word berserk. You know, we always talk about someone going berserk.
And I know that berserkers were a particular type of warrior. Are you saying they were giants?
Absolutely, and that's where we get that word, because they were so crazy. They were so like anything that the Roman legions had ever encountered, and that's where we get the word. So, getting back to Hitler sent out a crack group of SS agents called the Ahnenerbe, and they were looking for all of the artifacts, and we'll get to that too, but specifically they were looking for the giants, the golden sarcophaguses, and they went all over the world looking for those individuals.
Well, putting aside Hitler for the moment, I do want to ask about what genetic DNA coding might still be in some of us. That whether you know it, I know you've done a lot of work with genetics and you're very interested in that, and I want to find out whether there's anything in there that you've been able to find out about who might be, or what nation might be more inclined to have giants, whose national group is maybe the best genetic representation of the ancient giants. Also, then we'll return to these questions as you've established. And I want to go back to that Solomon Islands story and cannibalism. Did the giants there eat any of the invading Japanese armies? And does cannibalism continue today with giants? Oh, there's just so much more to get into. I haven't even talked about giant sex yet, but that's one of the questions that is standing up. Their sexual practices. Fascinating material. Stephen Quayle coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. My name's Ian Punnett. So we're talking with Stephen Quayle, whom I think might fairly be described a giant author of our time. As far as I know, the only author and researcher working so specifically in this field. One of his books, Giants, Genesis 6 Giants, Master Builders of Prehistoric and Ancient Civilizations, is the basis of our conversation now, but it just might also turn back into his other book, which I've been reading, Genetic Armageddon, Today's Technology, Tomorrow's Monsters. It all ties in with various conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks on Coast to Coast AM, and so many questions are hanging out there, and I know that many of you want to get in on the phones. It won't be until next hour, but we'll give you your chance to call then. Between now and then, I hope you sit back and enjoy this. Let's get into it more with Stephen Quayle next. We'll talk about those nasal noises that the giants made. And in his book, he's got drawings and there are references to historical archaeological records, including one giant skeleton clocking in at 36 feet. So where are any of those skeletons now? What is the tallest skeleton we have on record that people can actually go and see? And how come there aren't more stories in the mainstream media about something which Stephen Quayle says is so plain and see as well as a giant? Have to pick up the conversation with Stephen Quayle back on that subject of the Solomon Islands, because I really had never heard that, and I've been studying World War II for years, and so I really love that story. The idea that there's these invading Japanese forces that are repelled by a race of giants, or a group of giants that are there on the island. Now, how come that isn't covered more? What record do we have of it? Where are they now? And do they still practice cannibalism?
Well, yes, and let's go into the situation. As you're aware, studying the Second World War and the rumors and the references to cannibalism in the South Pacific Islands was, well known. I mean, there was no doubt. It was usually attributed to hungry soldiers, eating the vanquished victims. But there's actually a statue on one side of the island. Now, this whole thing is listed on my website under Solomon Island Giants. Actually, it's on the link we put up for all the coast-to-coast listeners. And I would say to anybody, read it before you disavow it. But the point being is there's actually a statue to the very battle that we're talking about. Now, when you're dealing with a subject of giants, you've got to understand, you asked me earlier, actually we were talking about before we went to break, about where all the skeletons are. A lot of the skeletons become the property of the U.S. government in the same sense of, unfortunately, a lot of the alleged UFO cover-up carries forward to the giants. Now, I'm on record as stating that I believe the Human Genome Project has a lot more than humanity as its root. 1/3 of all black budget expenses are going into genetic engineering and basically replicating what are called transhumans. A transhuman is actually something that transcends humanity. We've got now the situation where the giant's DNA is actively being sought. And for people that don't believe that, the British Museum a number of years ago said that they were able to extract live DNA from the sarcophagus and from the mummy of Ramesses II, and that they believe that basically they would be able to bring back reanimation, if you will, Jurassic giants, and I don't mean dinosaurs in this case, and that was a story that made a lot of news. Well, now we've got stories that DNA has been able to be extracted from a 1.8 million-year-old hominid. So when you ask me where the giants are, the quest is on, the search is on for what I would call the giant gene or the Hercules gene. Now, let me give you a good example of the Hercules gene.
Now, hang on a second. Just because I know you can make these connections so much faster than I can follow. So let me just hold you back a little bit. What would be the purpose then, and why aren't we hearing more about reproducing human giants, and what nation then might genetically have, or what group of people might have a genetic predisposition towards giantism?
Well, first of all, if you're talking about the medical, gigantism, which is, you can have a pituitary malfunction, or you can have a thing called acromegaly. Andre the Giant, so the wrestler, suffered from that. But I'm not talking about any medically inferior or physically inferior giants. The nations that are looking for the giants, if you will, let's call it the giant genes, are the Soviet Union, the Chinese, the U.S. Everybody's after them because, again, whether people like to admit it or not, the idea of finding the strength of these individuals, and not to mention their intelligence, is another thing. They weren't all ogres. They weren't all fee-fi-fo-fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman, okay? But the point being is that some of the people in history who were literally larger than life by reputation was because they were truly larger than everybody else around them. So can I give you an example of a girl that's being sought because they want the DNA of these individuals? They want it really bad. In the Ukraine, there's a little girl named Avaria Akulova. And this little girl weighs 40 kilos. It's about, 88 pounds. She is in the Guinness Book of...
A different future starts with you. That's why GoDaddy does more than help you find a name. You can create, sell, and get found online so any small business can make a change. We need a new generation of thinking, your way of thinking. Start different at GoDaddy.com.
World record records as being the strongest girl in the world. She can lift 800 pounds. Now, you're going to say, whoa, 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 how can that be? And if anybody wants to go see that article, it's on my website. It's called The World's Strongest Girl. I have a search engine. And by the way, when you spend 30 years at this with the skepticism and the ridicule,
sure,
I can back up what I say.
Well, that's so much to your credit that you take the time to do that. So as a skeptic, let me say thank you, because it makes it so much, it really puts flesh on the bones on this for me.
Right. Well, they've identified a gene in this little girl of Varya, and they've actually called it the Hercules gene, okay? Now, we know, obviously, Samson was an amazing guy in the Bible in the Old Testament times, because he was a literal figure. Some people doubt that, but there's too many records, and I don't want to argue that. But you're talking about a supernatural strength. I mean, 800 pounds for an 88-pound little girl is pretty striking. I mean, you know, you go to Gold's Gym and you watch the biggest guys with the biggest muscles, and I can tell you this, none of them I know can do that. And so they've identified the gene, the Hercules gene. Concurrent with the Hercules gene, they're looking for the longevity gene called the Methuselah gene, okay?
Right.
Because King Og of Bashan lived to be 500 years old. That's something that most people don't know. And whether they want to believe in longevity before the flood and after the flood, that can be argued. But again, they're looking for the genetic material to basically reanimate and bring these guys back. And again, most people say, oh, that's just ridiculous. When you've got British Museum, when you've got the U.S. military, when you've got the Russian military, when you've got the Chinese military, and everybody's on, believe it or not, the biggest giant hunt in history, you know, there's something to this. And this isn't science fiction. This isn't supposition. This isn't, you know, just throwing it out there to make people interested. This is really going on. And so when you get into the genetic makeup of these giants, the point that most people lose track of is that given some of the pharaohs, remember, the pharaohs were seen as gods, and when we see Hollywood's presentation of the pharaohs, it's not at all like some of the, especially the older kingdom. The older kingdom always represents the pharaohs as truly larger than most pharaohs, and they always have a predisposition towards an incredibly active sexual appetite. You asked me about that, and that's where, you know, we'll go there whenever you want to go there, because, again, the thing that's amazing when you understand the giants is that they were dispersed throughout the world, and it's my contention that you're seeing now the ancient civilizations that are coming up literally out of the ashes of history. Let me give you a good example. London was called, and most people don't know this, before it became London, England, it was called New Troy, because there's history in London, that Brutus, a Trojan, settled that and had to fight the two British giants who happened to be called Gog and Magog. And for those who think this is far-fetched, I also have the link on my site that every November, London celebrates with the giant caricatures of these two interesting individuals that were 18 feet tall, and they were literally chained to the city gates as a war trophy. I'm talking live ones, you know, and I'm talking, obviously, 1,000 years ago. But the point being is that when you've got Gog and Magog being the descendants of Og lived 500 years. He was the last of the Rephaim, the last of the Anakim. He was the guy that the DNA is being sought for. So I can tell you this, I was told by people in the know that the most important find or the related find to the tomb of Gilgamesh, 2/3 God was 1/3 man, was they wanted his DNA. They wanted it really badly. And they, meaning the people that go bump in the night.
Okay. So just to recap then, the story of the Solomon Islands giants is something which is better known regionally, including going so far as to have a statue in honor of this event, than it is internationally. But that there are some records then of this. Now, what happened to that? Are those people still there? Can they be found?
Well, they can be found, and the Guadalcanalese are interesting because, you know, Guadalcanal has a lot of underground, like lava tubes. It has a lot of underground facilities. Marius, the guy that I spoke to, a fascinating story there, just real quickly. Marius wanted to basically go and film some of the live giants. And wouldn't you know it, I won't go on record, but a certain intelligence agency did everything they could to try and literally keep him from going there, to the point of threatening his life. His wife, he's married to, by the way, a Guadalcanalese. And the Guadalcanalese literally talk about, right now in the Solomon Islands, especially in Guadalcanal, there's a lot of mining exploration going on, and there's literally an account that Marius relates that was related to him by one of his wife's relatives in the last several years, of a D5 tractor blade, that was taken off the tractor to be repaired, and it literally being thrown. So, thrown by a living giant. The thing was found, so many yards away. And by the way, this whole story's on my website under, on your Coast to Coast link, okay?
Right.
And I want people to go there and read it. And, Ian, you would be interested because, again, with your understanding of World War II, it's got a lot of the beaches that we landed on, the Japanese landed on, and Marius has identified everything, so it's pretty easy to follow the whole treatise. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read that yet on your site link.
No, I haven't, but I will. I mean, I was just looking at something today on that on the History Channel. Very interesting. Well, why then are giants so shy? Because if we had to look at the history of giants as you present them, these giants were dominating figures. And they created awe and respect, not just because of their physical presence, although that was intimidating and part of it, but also because of their mental abilities. And they appeared to be leaders in various cultures all around the world. So when did they start to become reluctant to be leaders? And why did they start shrinking away from the spotlight?
Well, I think shrinking away is maybe not, not accurate, because basically when they were sought out and found out, they were killed, okay? Because, again, there's something almost problematic with being larger than life, is that, you not only do you stand head and shoulders above the rest, but, when you've got that kind of power, let's just go to a couple of famous ones that most people are unaware of. Charlemagne was a giant. St. Christopher was a giant. King Arthur, the legends surrounding Arthur are amazing, but Sir Gawain, his grave was 14 feet long. You deal with Merlin. You deal with all these characters from history that think, these are just made-up stories, blah, blah, blah. But then they find actual archaeological evidence dealing with these guys, and they truly are larger than life. One of the most interesting guys was one of the Caesars of Rome. His name was Maximinius. And Maximinius was able to outrun chariots. Now, that takes some pretty major leg power. And what you've got is, again, understand this, that whether people have ever seen the movie Universal Soldier with Jean-Claude Van Damme or not, the idea of the perfect soldier, one that doesn't need sleep, one that has, amplified or multiplied strength, wisdom, and the abilities of these guys, the giants, are amazing. For instance, when you're dealing with the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, you're always dealing with their myths of origin or their historical accounts of origin of the giants from the east coming with blonde hair building their cities. As you deal with the fabulous book that Graham Hancock wrote called Underworld, dealing with the sunken civilizations that basically met a cataclysmic end, like the pyramid structure off of Yonguni off the coast of Okinawa, you're dealing with massive structures. And it's my contention that all pyramids and that all of the massive temple structures that are lined up with their celestial coordinates, whether it's Orion or whatever specific constellation happens to be, there is no human basis of that knowledge, just like the Dogon tribe of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a real place. And the point is how do natives that run around pretty much half naked and have such incredible astronomical intelligence? This has been the question of the cave drawings in Altamira, Spain, or Lascaux, France. These are not just pictures of buffalo. These are some of the most amazing constellation and star charts. So I maintain that history, as you and I have been taught it, is phony. I believe that there is an answer to the megastructures that are around the world, and that mythology basically all relates back to the giants, and it gets back to fallen angels having sex with earth women.
Well, and that's going to be where we'll go more into before we get to phone calls for you coming up next hour. But by the way, I thought St. Christopher actually was renounced by the Catholic Church as not actually being a historical figure.
Well, I can tell you this, that the actual accounts of St. Christopher do not match the Catholic Church's, view of him, but I can tell you that there really was a guy named St. Christopher, and he was a giant. I go into that in my book, and I footnote all the background for people that want to know that.
But again, see, part of what you end up doing, it is a very interesting turn on that, though, is it ends up going back to that point of why did giants stop being leaders? When's the turn when giants start falling out as leaders among normal-sized men? What?
Well, I can tell you this because it usually went to their appetites, both for physical. I mean, the giants fell out of a fellowship or friendship even when there was kind of a mutual truce because, people quit, or they tired quickly of trying to feed these guys. And also the sexual habitats. I go into a situation of the sexual habits and the different habitats of the giants. I mean, these guys were, and no pun intended here, but they made rape, pillage, and plunder seem like child's play. There's actually an account in my book of one of the chroniclers of the conquistadors talking about a literal group of giants that were running the jungle literally being wiped out by the thunderbolts of heaven. Whether people believe that or not, I can only tell you this, that some guy in 1590, when he's tracking that story down, sure hasn't read Marvel Comics.
Okay, I can see that. Well, then have you talked about the sexual practices thing before on Coast to Coast? I know you were on with George back in July.
Yeah, no, I think we've never touched on that because, that gets into the book, and I think it's important. We'll do that, delicately and in good taste.
All right, then do you want to just go back and clear up the thing about the nasal sounds?
Sure. Interesting. Brian Snowdy, who's one of the best historic artists in the world, and I got to tell you, he's the guy that did the drawings that are on my website of the Mayans and the Incas. There was a thing that was noted in so many archaeological accounts, and also even in Nepal, about a thing called harmonic levitation. And it's recorded that the giants were able to create such an incredible kind of shrill noise that they could literally change the weight. Now, I don't know how they did it. I'm just telling you that this is what's recorded. And that when they would do that, somehow they were able to actually levitate or move incredibly large and heavy objects. It's called harmonic levitation.
Okay. Well, let's stop there for the moment, and then we'll get into everything else because there's still so much in this material. The books of Stephen Quayle, you can link up to his website at coasttocoastam.com. And all of the rest of my questions, and then we'll start doing yours coming up next hour. During the top of the hour break, I had run down the hallway and I was looking at some of the photos that I hadn't had a chance to see yet on Stephen Quayle's website, and I got that through coasttocoastam.com, and I was so into it that I forgot I was actually talking to you, and I almost was late coming back from the break at the top of the hour, because I was reading some of the articles that you have up there and looking at some of the photos I hadn't seen before, and that is, they're very compelling, and it's one thing to talk about a story or to have a drawing of something that somebody reported 2,000 years ago. It's a whole other thing to have photos. And there's so many interesting photos. Can I ask you, though, just to explain, if you can, for me, the difference between giantism, this condition as you referred to earlier with like Andre the Giant, or the giant that was in the movie Big Fish, who just died within the last week or so. That condition, which usually prevents a long and healthy life for people who are that tall, and the giants of yore or lore.
Well, the difference is, Ian, you pretty much handled it. Again, Andre the Giant's a good example. When you've got a certain condition of the pituitary gland, it can cause, your growth hormone to continue to function as opposed to shutting down. But what usually happens, you have an implied weakness Your muscles ultimately give out. And most people that suffer from gigantism in that realm usually die very young. I don't think Andre the Giant was very old when he died. I think he was in his mid-30s or maybe early 40s. But the point is that the giants of history, these guys are all incredibly long-lived and long-lived.
Right.
And they're stronger than anything. And also, I once got called on the carpet when someone said, well, there's no study showing that a bigger brain means implied intelligence. And I said, well, I can only tell you this, that if you will even grant to me the idea that mankind didn't just all of a sudden get, become smarter and smarter. He was taught amazing feats of science and technology. And for the reference I use on that is the Book of Enoch, which is one of the oldest non-biblical, when I say it's not included in the canon of Scripture.
Right, non-canonical, we would say.
Right, non-canonical. But the point is the Book of Enoch has got a fascinating history. Now, they have found the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I also have on my website, my main Giants website, and people can go and read, because it leads us into the question, what were their sexual habits of the giants? Listen, they went after everything. They didn't stop with women. They didn't stop with their fellow male giants. They didn't stop with children. They went after the animals. And that's, again, when you understand the mythology of whether it's Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology, when you get into all of everything from the Cyclops to the satyrs, et cetera, you come into a whole different realm, because they obviously have a different life force. They have a different energy. And by the way, the metabolism of these individuals, I was told by some very bright men who are into this, tracking, and whether people accept this or not, but their body temperature is in the neighborhood of, they run hot because of their metabolism, about 250, 275 degrees. That's Fahrenheit. We're at 98.6. So their appetites are literally ferocious.
They're burning through a lot of calories. But on the photos, on these really cool photos, and again, Stephen, just, congratulations. I really mean it. Wonderful job on cataloging some photos I have never seen, including some of the biggest dang people that could ever have existed, it seems. And so I ask you, though, why, when we look at those photos, do we think that those are giants as opposed to people who are suffering from giganticism?
Well,
why do we think they didn't die a week after that photo was taken, for example?
Well, because in so many of the cases, and when you click on them, you can basically get the background, like Jean Petrucin. I mean, that guy was a circus giant. He's the guy that looks like a Viking in some of the pictures on my website.
Right.
That man was phenomenally strong. He lived to be, very old-aged, and, I mean, he was huge, okay?
But he was not you're saying he wasn't one of the pituitary giants?
He was not a pituitary entity.
Okay.
The other thing that you asked me a while back, and again, Ian, there's like, a million years of history to cover in 2 hours, 3 hours.
Sure.
But here's the deal. The anomalous event that the Bible and ancient history records is that the giants that they were talking about 6 fingers, 6 toes, okay, and double sets of teeth. And that's a fascinating subject, because even when you get, and I don't want to get into that yet in case you want to go there, but even the Roswell crashed UFO panel was set up for 6 fingers on 2 hands, okay? And most people don't even know that. But what you're dealing with is unusual physiological characteristics. Now, medical science says if you have 6 fingers on one hand, it's called polydactylism, okay?
Right.
That's not unusual. 6 fingers, 6 toes, very unusual. Double sets of teeth, very unusual. Well, invariably, when I do a show on Coast to Coast with George, and I'm sure it'll happen after we're done on this, I'll get calls from all over the country, and people say, my son had 6 fingers, 6 toes, double sets of teeth. What does that mean? And I say, I would love to have some of his DNA, a piece of hair. Because, again, what's fascinating is that some people may have one or the other. Unless they have all 3 sets, they don't have to worry. If they've got all 3 sets, in other words, a double 6 fingers, 6 toes,
right,
and double sets of teeth, then you've got something. I got news for you. The guys in black, meaning the men in black, would be to their house before I would. Because again, see, here's a question that has to be asked.
No, but could you be polydactyl and have 2 sets of teeth and just be normally sized?
Well, forgive me, but I have yet to come across anybody that fits that.
Okay.
I have had people call me who have told me that their uncles or their grandfathers were 8 feet tall, and they died. That is not in their current lineage, but they had all 3 of the requirements. And one lady said, "Does that mean, I'm a giant?" I said, "Well, how tall are you?" And she said, 5'10". I said, "Nope, that doesn't qualify."
Right.
So here's the thing. I can't tell at this point, this is ongoing. I can't tell what it takes to accelerate that. But if you're burning the metabolism, if the giant's body temperature is that high, and you've got to then understand that obviously the cellular structure that's making the energy in the cell has got to be at a phenomenal rate. So that means it's vibrating or it has a higher harmony or a higher frequency. And so, there's stuff there that I just physically don't have the answers for.
Right.
And that's what all the spooks are looking for. And I'm telling you, when I tell you this, the spooks are out there. I think one of the most important things I've got to draw everyone's attention to is the amulet that's on my website, okay? Did you see the amulet?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. The amulet, and the reason why this is important, this is about 4,000 years old, okay? This was given to a lady that came to physically seek me out. Her father in Turkey received it, whenever it's on the website. But if you notice the headdress on this gentleman, it looks, and for those who are listening on the radio that aren't on the internet right now, the guy is at least, based on the size of the individual, he's at least 10 feet tall. But what's interesting is his head is almost conical shaped, and that matches the 7 sages in Nemrut Dog. And I don't know if you've been there.
No, I haven't.
Okay. But in essence, there are 7 giant thrones in Turkey, and one of the heads on the individual statues that's fallen over looks identical to this gentleman on the amulet. The little guy looks like he's an alien, and again, there's a standard spiel that this was a Commodity empire, which absolutely, I've talked to the archaeologists, some of them that work there, and they said, "Steve, this thing is so old, it predates Alexander and Antiochus and everybody."
Well, I wonder, too, whether you've heard of this, and I don't know because I've tried to get to as many of the links as I could on your website, so pardon me if I'm telling you something you already know all about. The Stick Indians?
Right.
Of the Yakimas, the legends of the Stick Indians. This was sent to me by Joe in Texas. He said they were the spirit brothers of the Yakimas. They were a lot like what we think of as Big Feet or Sasquatches. Their legends in a nutshell is that they lived in the woods like animals without houses. They wore grizzly bear hair clothings. It was said that when they needed a new garment, they would stalk a grizzly about their own size, kill it, and skin it out. Since they didn't use tools except a long stick that they carried, they would skin the bear with their fingernails. They would then make monk-like hoods with the bear's heads and drape their cloak down to their feet. The bear's arms and legs were tied around the Stick Indians' arms and legs. They were highly feared by the Yakimas. They were treated with great caution and respect. The Stick Indians were also called that because when they were roaming around villages, they would poke a stick through the door of the teepee or a wigwam to see if a woman or a child inside screamed. If they did, the Stick Indians would steal the women for sex slaves and the children for food. And he was just wondering whether we had heard about them. And I hadn't, but they sound a lot like it sort of follows the characteristics, as you've described them, of giants.
Well, right. And one of the things I track is the appearance of cannibalism throughout the world. A lot of people don't understand that when you've got Easter Island, they ate themselves out of existence. That's because everybody was having grandma over for lunch and not letting her go home, okay?
Yikes.
She was lunch. The Easter Islanders had a famous curse, your grandmother's flesh lies rotting in my teeth, Nice greeting, huh? And then when you deal with Texas and the giants of Texas and the Karnakawas, that's where we get the statement being eaten alive. These guys would basically tie someone to a stake and then run up and chop a piece of meat off and, eat it in front of the person. So you've got the giants all through history. I have never found any vegetarian or vegan giants.
Yeah. Now, same thing's true, though. You believe that in the United States, the area around New York would have been where we would call now the New York Giants, although I guess they're technically in New Jersey, so maybe that doesn't count. But somewhere in New York, that's where that's where the greatest evidence is of giants in the United States.
No, the greatest evidence of giants in the United States, believe it or not, is and has been in Florida, because the Carib Indians, from which we get the word Caribbean, were also cannibals, and there are people that dispute that. But after doing the last show I did with George on giants, a lady archaeologist called me and told me of the incredible finds that they have found. I'm sure she's listening tonight. And the fascinating thing about Florida is that Florida seemed to have had a sea route of a lot of the very large individuals that settled both Latin America and South America when they headed north. And this is something that most people don't understand. The burial mounds in the Pennsylvania, Ohio Valley region, where the serpent mounds are and stuff, even into Missouri, there have been massive. I would say this, I have probably in my files over 1,000 cases of old newspapers talking about 12 to 14-foot giants and talking about, again, the cannibalistic nature of them in the United States. And, for a long time, until, good night, Nature magazine or Discover magazine came out, a lot of people wouldn't realize that the Anasazi, which are the ancient ones, they fought the idea of cannibalism in the desert Southwest until they found out there were a lot of bones with human teeth marks on them. And, so let me share this. The cannibalistic practices throughout the world, I have spent almost 2 decades tracking to the giants. That doesn't mean that all cannibals are giants, because you can go into New Guinea and find normal. But the introduction of that practice, again, with the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, they not only practiced ritual sacrifice, they practiced, a 3-course meal out of the different captives they were able to conquer in battle.
All right. And then just to wrap it up to make sure we included it all on there, what about their sexual practices, the giants' sexual practices, might have led to their demise, or at least to being diminished around the globe?
Well, from a standpoint of God, in my opinion, set barriers, and this is one of the reasons why in the Old Testament there are specific, men are forbidden to lie with beasts, and if a man lied with the beast, both the person or persons who lied with the beast were put to death. And the beast was too, and I always thought that was unfair, because I don't think that beast had a vote in that. Right, so. But here's the deal, okay? You've got to understand that when Noah, listen, the bloodlines, that Coast has had different stories with bloodlines, but Noah and his family were preserved because they were perfect in their generations. These giants literally went after everybody and everything. They corrupted every God-ordained barrier that was possible to corrupt. And when you get into the Oannes, O-A-N-N-E-S myth, when you get into Poseidon and you get into Neptune and you get into all this stuff, you'll find that all of the gods of the Greeks and Romans all trace back to a literal and physical giant that assumed godlike qualities because of their power, their intelligence, not only their prowess, but also, look, they dominated with a heavy tooth, literally.
Right. Well, but if we go to the story of Noah, though, you believe that the giants survived the flood.
I believe the giants were destroyed in the flood. I believe that after the flood, there was a secondary time of angelic visitation with women.
Oh, okay.
And see, because that's how you explain Goliath. Goliath, by the way, and his brothers, when David went down to the brook Kidron to get 5 smooth stones, not only was David going to take care of Goliath, but his brothers. And it specifically states that they were 6-fingered, 6-toed individuals.
What?
Now, where it's going now, in my opinion, is again the attempt is going to be made genetically with mankind cooperating to his own destruction. The idea is to find the DNA to produce transhuman entities and basically say goodbye to mankind. And in my book, Genetic Armageddon, that's why I titled it that, because that's what we're headed to, in my opinion.
But Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh was a giant in that epic?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If Noah was based on the story of Gilgamesh, and there's some debate about that, but
he wasn't, because Noah was perfect in his generation. It by the very definition, I know what you're going for, and I just want to clarify. There is no indication that Noah was Gilgamesh. Listen, form critics, as you know, and everybody can take apart the Noah's flood, but, it's still argued, was a flood global or universal? Yet explain, seashells on Mount Everest, and I think that kind of blows that it was local.
Okay. But it would explain how giants, without having to have a second wave of angelic visitation, if Noah were a giant or had, a giant genes anyway, it could have explained how that continued on if Gilgamesh and Noah were related. But you say they aren't, so we'll just leave that there for now and say that we'll give all the numbers. And as you heard me say at the beginning of this, I know where it's going to start. I have no idea where it's going to end. And Stephen Quayle is living up to all of his billing from all of you. Your chance to talk to him next on Coast to Coast AM. My name's Ian Punnett. Stephen Quayle takes his research very seriously. And that's why typically in a Stephen Quayle book, what you'll find are more footnotes than there are pages, which means that by and large there's a footnote for every page, if not more. And that's good because he makes a lot of connections and uses a lot of material that's in mainstream media to make his points. And we'll get back to your phone calls for him in just a moment as we line them up as we speak. Let me just ask Stephen Quayle, since we didn't have a chance to talk about the second book much, although we referenced it, and I say second book to our discussion tonight, Genetic Armageddon. How do you believe this pursuit for giants will lead to a genetic Armageddon?
Well, first of all, I believe that there's a very malevolent force in the universe, Satan, that is bent on destroying all humanity. And I believe that the words of Jesus, he said, if the days weren't short, there'd be no flesh left alive, no descendants of Adam. I believe in a replacement transhumans. And, when you've got the technology that's headed towards basically being able to combine human and animal DNA, which is probably one of the greatest affronts, I believe, in heaven. If you look at the history of even the pre-Adamic civilizations like Lemuria, Mu, Atlantis, when the inhabitants of those areas, whether you believe it or not, when they got into this realm, it's when the destruction came. And I believe, Ian, what it is it's a harbinger of a total destructive phase. Listen, these guys aren't only dealing with DNA of giants, they're also dealing with viruses that have been dormant, have been set in suspended animation, that once they're released, it makes the bird flu and the combination viruses of mouse pox and Ebola pox and everything else seem like Little League.
Well,
and it's my contention that mankind is incredibly arrogant and that in their contempt for God, they have taken the place that science can answer all things. But when you can see only to step 3 and it's step 7 that kills you, I think now mankind has gone beyond the threshold, and in my opinion, we're at about step 5. Because when you're dealing with genetic Armageddon, when you're dealing with recombinant DNA, and you're combining animal and human DNA, and you're getting things like the chimeras or chimeras, when you're getting humansies, humans, chimpanzees, the point is that there were God-given barriers. Now that man is learning how to fool and mess around with this stuff. And by the way, it's fascinating when you go and read some of the old hieroglyphics. It's almost like some of the pharaohs knew that their chance at a second shot wasn't by obeying the Book of the Dead, but that, their gods, little g's, would bring them back in the later time. So it is my contention that genetic Armageddon means the last battle for the real human seed versus a transhuman or hybrid seed. And as we haven't even got to that whole thing, but when you deal with the alien issue, I don't believe that the aliens, the Anunnaki, came here and created us, and I call them the Anunnaki, or Anunnaki, because it seems like they're going an awful long distance to mess around with human females. And the point is that you're dealing now with a subject that what the giants did, the fallen angels were able to accomplish by cohabiting with earth women based on the book of Genesis and the book of Jude, now, quote, the aliens are doing to bring about a race. Because you're dealing, obviously, and please, there's so many different ideas on the aliens, but I deal with that in my book called Aliens and Fallen Angels, the Sexual Corruption of the Human Race. And for those that want to know, this is not a, quote, just flash in the pan for me. I've spent a lot of time, and when I talk to scientists, when I talk to double and triple PhD people, there are the ones that will talk on record, they're the ones that will talk off record, and I got to tell you, Ian, the ones that talk off record are the ones that are telling you the truth.
We'll leave it there for now, and we'll come back for everybody's calls, your chance to engage Stephen Quayle in this ongoing and unpredictable conversation. No matter where you are across the country, coast to coast tonight, we just ask that you now be here with us, and we'll take your calls. Kurt, west of the Rockies, for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. Kurt?
Hey, how are you?
Terrific, thank you.
I'm calling from Phoenix, Arizona.
Glad to have you.
Well, I missed the first hour, but I came on the second hour, and I've been listening to you all. And I know that you're a somewhat Bible scholar and what have you. And I've never had a chance on Coast to Coast. I've called many times, but to ask somebody that might know more detail into Ezekiel chapter 1, which deals with. Well, I guess they're sort of giant. The wheels in the sky, and the figures that came out of those wheels in the sky, and that they were weird-looking people and things, and actually they were angels of God. And so many people right now, Hollywood, speak of aliens in UFOs to come down and want to eat people and all of that, but in all reality, even thousands of years ago, there were these wheels in the sky, and that they were angels of God to give messages and what have you. But our fake Hollywood stories have made aliens and UFOs in the sky to come down and want to take over the world when actually they were from God.
Okay,
well that's a good question. I think there's the answer that's obvious. There are good angels and there are bad angels. What you're talking about, sir, in the book of Ezekiel is you're talking about cherubim, and a cherubim is not an angel. It talks about the wheels. A lot of people have likened that to UFOs, but the point that I think in the book of Ezekiel is he's having a vision of more of a heavenly situation, and I think that, when you read that, but I agree with you. First of all, I think that God has been relegated to the back burner, and science fiction and all sorts of monstrosities and imaginary and real entities have displaced God through the medium of television, the motion picture. And I tell people all the time, I say, listen, because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it isn't true. There are people that automatically think, anything that comes to the Bible can't be true. For the record, I have read literally thousands of volumes of stuff that's as old as you can go in history, and I can tell you this, the central theme of good versus evil is prevalent, and when you're dealing with the giants, you're never dealing with a nice guy showing up to have a good time. You're always dealing with very evil and malevolent individuals that are their total desire is to consume, in this case, eat and destroy humanity.
When did that change then? Because so many of the photos you have then of people who you believe are not suffering from gigantism but are giants aren't reported as cannibals or berserkers.
No, and I want to make it clear. Thanks for bringing that up, Ian. What I'm showing on my website is the individuals that absolutely are so much taller, so much different than, quote, standard, what would you say, medium or normal people. The ones that are the cannibals in history, and I thought I made it clear, but I'll make it double clear, the six-fingered, six-toed, double-teeth individuals.
Okay, those we limit cannibalism to them.
Yes, and by the way, the Solomon Island giants fit into that category.
Do they really?
Yes, sir.
All right, Nathan on the wild card line for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. Nathan?
How are you doing? Hello. Hi, how are you? My name is Nathan. I'm in Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Quayle, I just wanted to say I love your work, and I'm a big person who studies the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, Rephaim, and biblical prophecy. And the types of work that you're doing really fires me up and just really keeps me wanting to study everything out because, you know, it talks about how the Rephaim wanted to try and destroy David, and they had 6 fingers, 6 toes, and just huge giants. One of my main questions that I wanted to ask you tonight is, what is your take on possibly the future of the giants? Because Jesus does say in Matthew 24 that just as in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. And I just wanted to figure out what your take would be on that.
Well, thank you for that question, and that's my contention that when Jesus made that statement, most people didn't know what the days of Noah were like, but these are the individuals that when God destroyed the earth, these are the individuals that were destroyed in the flood. So I believe that through genetic engineering and all of the search for the genes of the giants, not to mention the living ones that are hidden away in dark Dr. Moreau-like laboratories, I believe that's going to be one of the signs of the end times, and I think we're right there.
Randall, first-time caller line for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. Randall?
Yes, good morning. I'm calling from Windrock, Arizona.
Glad to have you.
I have a question for Mr. Quayle. I was wondering if he may have heard of the Navajo folklore of a giant that was slain by 2 twins. Has he ever heard of that folklore?
Well, I've heard of some Indian folklore, and that's one of the things I tracked down, but I have not heard of that specific instance.
Okay, yeah. In this case, the Navajos have a folklore that at one time, way back when man was created, there was giants and monsters that were decimating the human race. And in one of our folklores, the lady, she's called Changing Woman, she gives birth to these 2 twins. These 2 twins travel to the Father, the Son, and they get this weapon, a lightning weapon or whatever it may be. They come back to Earth, and they battle this giant. So tonight you were talking about the Nephilim, giants and whatnot you were talking about, which kind of shed light on our folklore that we tell about, you know, the giants that these 2 twins fought. You know, it just kind of shine light on that for me because, you know, we tell folklore, and I'm sure there's other Indian tribes that tell folklore of giants. And,
right, and let me share this. What you're talking about is interesting because the Sioux, the Native Americans, have such a rich history in this stuff, and it's like by the way, it's fascinating that you would share that with me. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Sure.
But the Sioux Indians during the time of Buffalo Bill Cody brought giant remains into the camp that Buffalo Bill was at and basically showed him and told him a very similar story of that, okay? And I have that in my book.
Yeah.
But I don't believe it's just, quote, myth. I believe it's real, and I believe that obviously so many Native Americans, especially when you get into the East Coast, and even the California Indians, the Catalina Indians and stuff, they talk openly about battling the giants. And the way the Native Americans would take care of the giants would literally go into caves, and the Native Americans would build fires and end up suffocating them in the caves. And that's why so many times when the giant skeletons show up, they're always in a mining-type situation or in an underground situation.
Yeah, you know, the Navajos tell those folklores. You know, then again, it could be something like the 2 may have been given some kind of a laser weapon to fight the Nephilim. You know
well,
what I mean?
I can tell you this, that there are, again, in South America, there are literally accounts written and chronicled by the conquistadors where they're interviewing the different natives, and they talk about literally lightning bolts from heaven killing some of these guys. So, you know, whether people believe that or not, the lightning bolts, I would say, figure very prominently into the destruction of the giants.
Well, I guess in a way, part of that would just seem to make sense in that lightning would be attracted to the tallest structure that was around. So,
good point.
I mean, in that way, there would be some scientific evidence to say that giants would be likely candidates for a lightning strike.
And you could go on even to take that a little further, because again, when you're talking about just the simple temperature, body temperature, and the mineralization in the giants, you would also be basically a walking lightning rod, not
Sure.
just because of the stature, but by the mineralization due to the metabolism. So you bring up two fascinating points.
All right, wild card line, J-Man for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. J-Man?
Good evening, gentlemen.
Evening.
Well, I was curious about earlier you referenced the giants having the ability to use a nasal frequency of some kind to move objects. You also said that the pharaohs possibly were giants. So I guess are you maybe hinting at that the pharaohs could have been using these frequencies to build the pyramids? And if so, what is the significance of the shape of the pyramid?
Well, that's a good question. I maintain that it wasn't Hebrew slaves that built the pyramids. And let me share this. Not only was the frequency an issue, but there are literal records of some of these guys being able to lift 10,000 pounds. Now, you've got the stone of the pregnant woman in Baalbek, Lebanon, which is absolutely non-explainable in the natural. Number one, how a stone of that size could be quarried, and number two, how it could be moved. And when you've got the literal multi-thousand-year-old references to what's called harmonic levitation, not to mention if a guy can lift 10,000 pounds with one hand, 10 tons with two, the point is that these are physical records of these individuals being able to lift that. So, again, it is my contention that they were built by the Nephilim, and pyramids, for the record, are worldwide. They're certainly not only in the Middle East, and they're all over the world.
Right, but just to be clear on J-Man's question, built with their noses?
No,
okay.
Built with their hands, but they were able to change. When I say built with their noses, I'm telling you that there are recorded cases of harmonic levitation, which the Buddhists to this day in Nepal claim is how they built their temples on the rocks.
Okay.
So the point is, I'm saying, coupled with the strength, and again, you've got stones in some of the different areas around the world in the temples that are so uniquely cut. There's no way to even deal with that in a modern situation or setting.
Let's go to the international line where Bruce is waiting for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. Bruce?
Oh, hello. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. Hello, Ian. Question for Stephen there is, I was listening a few weeks ago and you had Patrick Heron on.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds similar on the business of giants. And I'm just wondering if Stephen has any knowledge of Patrick Heron, or if they've communicated, or if their research resembles their,
good question. Number one, I know Patrick Heron. Number two, I've read his book. Number three, the research. When you've got a common thread.
People say I'm no good and crazy as a loon. When your brother gets the phone.
I ain't be got no weapon. Why you be gotta pull a knife on me? I be shot. Wonderful.
Captain, how soon can you land?
I can't tell.
You can tell me I'm a doctor.
No, I mean, I'm just not sure.
Or can't you take a guess?
Well, not for another 2 hours.
You can't take a guess for another 2 hours?
No. I mean, we can't land for another 2 hours.
Police! Throw down your guns!
Hey! You call this slop? Real slop has got chunks of things in it. This is more like gruel. And this Chateau LeBlanc 68 is supposed to be served slightly chilled. This ain't room temperature. What do you think we are? Animals?
Well, looks like the cows have come home to roost. How you doing, Trooper?
Should I fix you some sandwiches?